Will you please pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O God, you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Ile de Jean Charles is on the coast of Louisiana. It's the home of the Biloxi, Chickamauga, Choctaw tribe, and it's in that part of the state where land is an ambiguous category. The 99 people who live there have the dubious distinction of having been named America's first climate refugees. Their land is 98% underwater now, and so they're trying to figure out whether there is any option to stay or whether they have to leave, to relocate from the lands on which they've lived for generations and on which their way of life depends. They're not alone. Inupiat communities in Western Alaska face a similar decision as coastal erosion that's caused by the loss of sea ice and increased storm intensity threatens their villages and their way of life. Portland, Oregon, meanwhile, has become an unlikely new home for climate refugees from Micronesia, where small islands are becoming uninhabitable due to sea level rise. And many of the migrants from Central America, the human faces of the humanitarian crisis at our southern border, are fleeing climate change too. Years of drought followed by devastating floods have devastated small family farms, and people have fled north, seeking economic opportunity, a way to feed their children. In Jesus' time, the most vulnerable were widows and orphans, people who lacked the social safety net in that strongly family-oriented culture. Climate change is creating whole new categories of most vulnerable. People displaced, impoverished, separated from means of sustenance, from family and community by the disruptions of a changing climate. People who are becoming the least of these. Our response to them, to all of the least of these, is a central concern of today's gospel lesson. In it, Jesus is talking to the disciples, pointing to a future time when Christ, the Son of Man, will return to sit on the throne of his glory and judge all the nations. Jesus tells them that people will be separated into two categories, those who inherit the kingdom and those who are sent to the eternal fire. Those who inherit the kingdom, the sheep in the metaphor Jesus is using, are those who showed mercy to all whom they met, and who, in so doing, it turns out, showed mercy to Christ. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. The merciful ask for clarification about that surprising I pronoun. Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, they ask. They can't recall having encountered in their daily travels the Son of Man, this King of Kings, the one currently enthroned in his glory. And surely they would have noticed him. The king reassures them that they heard him right. Truly, I tell you, the king says in Jesus' telling, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, so you did it to me. Christ, the Son of Man, we are to understand, doesn't just care for the least of these from a safe and kingly distance. He identifies himself so intimately with them that what we do to one of them, we do to him. We find Christ, in other words, on the margins, with the persecuted, the oppressed, the poor, the most vulnerable, right there amidst the least of these. This story points to that most staggering truth. Through Christ, God is with us in the messiness of human life. In the darkest, hardest, most desolate places, Christ puts himself there, right there in the thick of the worst of it. That is good news. And also, if we take it seriously, as we must, it is deeply challenging news. Because while this is a story about future judgment, it is also, and maybe mostly, a story about how we live our lives here and now. And that story is unambiguous. To serve Jesus is to serve the least of these. To serve the least of these is therefore more than a humanitarian impulse. It's not a utilitarian act to get us into heaven, which is how the goats in the story seemed inclined to think about it. To serve the least of these is the very essence of faith. It's how we are to be. We are to respond to those in need as we would to Jesus. And maybe we should let that sink in for just a moment. We are to respond to those in need as we would to Jesus. That part of this story, it rings loudly in this climate-changed world. In this world where the stories of the people on Ile de Jean Charles, the people on Alaska's coast, in Micronesia, or the ones who arrive desperate at our southern border, are not isolated stories. Where those stories are part of a bigger picture, one that points to a systemic failure of mercy. To see that picture, try conjuring up a map of the world in your head. We're going to color it in. So imagine putting dark purple shading in Central America, on the east coast of South America, in equatorial Africa, the subcontinent of India, and most of East Asia, especially the small island states of Oceania. Those purple areas that you are maybe visualizing right now are the areas where people are most vulnerable to climate change. They're the places most exposed to its risks: excessive heat, flooding and drought, sea level rise, disruptions to the food supply, and they are also the places least able to afford to mitigate those risks. So what you're visualizing is a map of the new least of these, the people whose well-being is under threat, not in the future, but right now, today, because of climate change. It's under threat because of how we, Americans and Europeans, have been living our lives. The carbon in the atmosphere that's changing the climate right now, it belongs to us, to our way of life that now threatens the least of these. Just as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me. One of the big problems with climate change is that it's so hard to grasp because it's so big. It's colors on a map that easily become a piece of abstract art. And it can feel distant, affecting people we have never met, people whose lives are far removed from our daily lives. This text today, this gospel lesson, calls us to think differently about that map we're imagining. It calls us to draw it close to our hearts. How do we feel about that map if we consider that the purple shading represents faraway faces in which we would see the face of Jesus? How would we respond to that map? The text is pretty clear about how we should respond: with mercy. But what does it mean to show mercy to the whole world? That feels like a tall order. But I think the text gives us a hint. I think we need to be more like sheep. Sheep, as Jesus would have understood them, have some qualities we could learn from. And I know that sheep get a bad rap these days. To be a sheep nowadays is to be not especially bright, excessively obedient. But in Jesus's day, sheep had a different vibe. They were respected not just because they were valuable, but because of how they were together. The collective noun for a group of sheep, a flock, is also a verb. To flock is to move or to come together. And that's what sheep do. They move together. They come together. Theologian Catherine Keller writes that in an ancient agricultural context, sheep had connotations not of penned-in, passive, and pretty obedience, but of a roving coexistence in the wilderness. A roving coexistence in the wilderness. When they're threatened, sheep don't turn on each other or go their separate ways. They stick together, forming a circle facing outwards. They seek mutual protection. What would it mean for us to live like that? How might that map of a climate-changed world start to look different if we thought about it with more sheep-like sensibilities? Sensibilities that prompt us to see our neighbors, all of them, but especially the least of these among us, as members of our flock. I think it would mean seeing the threat of climate change not as a faraway hazard confronting someone we don't know, but as a threat to our mutual coexistence, which it is. And our response to that threat, if we're thinking like sheep, would be to come together in order to care for the whole flock, especially the least of these. Our response to that threat would be to work for the common good, not just our own good. That means working for systemic change that rights the wrongs that make that map of vulnerability you imagined a while back possible. It means working for systemic change that creates civic, political, and economic structures that are merciful, not predatory, that enact love, not cruelty. Jesus knew better than anyone that none of us is purely sheep or purely goat. We are all a little bit of both. This text asks us to nurture our sheep-like tendencies for Jesus' sake. And yes, we can choose to see what this text asks of us as sacrifice, giving up on that much vaunted individualism that we have been told to prize. But as we rove through this wilderness time, the one we're in right now, I wonder if maybe we're ready to embrace a different way, ready to come together to nurture a roving coexistence in this wilderness time that we travel through, ready to move together, all of us, on God's still green earth as members of a flock that cares for its own, which is every last one of us, especially the least of these, the ones in whose faces we see Jesus, whom we joyfully follow. Amen.